I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator Rick Scott slammed leadership at the Fed on the Senate floor Wednesday afternoon. While the Florida Republicans squarely blamed President Biden for rising inflation, he said the Fed helped, quote, grease the wheels. This comes just one day after the Senate confirmed Lael Brainerd as the central bank's vice chair. Let's listen in.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, the Senate is considering several of President Biden's picks to sit on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve. I've already voted against two of these nominees. I believe they all should be voted down by the Senate. Under its current leadership, the Fed has lost the trust of the American people and failed to uphold its role as an independent body. I've been clear about my disapproval of the Fed's policies, especially its massive and still growing balance sheet. Both now and throughout recent history, the Federal Reserve has been behind the curve and far too late in taking action to keep America's economy stable. Its policies to sustain and grow such a massive, disproportionate growing balance sheet are a perfect example of its failure to properly manage the economic needs of our nation. For years, I have urged Chair Powell and members of the Federal Open Market Committee to reduce the Fed's unprecedented balance sheet. Nothing has changed. Month after month, we've watched the Fed continue to purchase billions in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. There's still no plan to wind down and right-size the Fed's balance sheet, which today sits at nearly 40% of GDP. Before the pandemic in 2019, the Fed's balance sheet assets totaled just under $4 trillion. Today, it's more than double to nearly $9 trillion. That's more than 10 times the assets the Fed held in 2007, when the balance sheet was under $1 trillion. Mr. President, the Federal Reserve's massive balance sheet has become a massive problem. When the Fed buys up treasuries and mortgage-backed securities and holds them like this, it is distorting the credit markets and allocation of capital, ultimately hurting our poorest families and Americans on fixed incomes. And look at how the Fed's policies have made homeownership unattainable for young people. These policies have helped drive up home prices, putting the purchase of a home further out of reach for young families across our nation. Now, I will admit that the COVID-19 pandemic presented our nation with historic challenges, but the Federal Reserve's overreaction and then refusal to react to changing economic circumstances over the last year is unacceptable. The Fed's mismanagement and their management failures have been especially disastrous during the Biden administration. Instead of fighting for the interests of American families, it has chosen to appease an administration hell-bent on reckless inflation fueling and spending. It's clear to me that the raging inflation crisis we are seeing across America is the fault of Joe Biden and Joe Biden alone. But the Fed's weak appeasement has helped grease the wheels in advancing Biden's reckless spending agenda. This isn't just my opinion. The Fed knows this is true. Just weeks ago, the San Francisco Fed wrote that the spending packages Biden pushed to allegedly counteract the effects of the pandemic actually fueled inflation. I've written letters, held meetings, and had phone calls with Chair Powell and members of the Federal Open Market Committee to express my concerns and demand action to shrink the balance sheet. Again, Chair Powell and the Federal Reserve has chosen to do nothing. Not one member of the Board of Governors has been able to explain to me why the balance sheet is so big and what size it should be. At every turn, when the Fed could have been fighting for American families by mitigating the long-term risk of its massive balance sheet and telling the truth about the terrible consequences of reckless government spending, it instead chose to appease Joe Biden, Wall Street, and the Democrats running Washington, all at the expense of American families. How does Biden reward the Fed for playing nice with him? By turning Chair Powell into his inflation scapegoat. Earlier today in the Senate Commerce Committee, after I asked the administration when inflation would come back down, Secretary Raimondo deflected and blamed Chair Powell and the Fed. But here's my question. If the Federal Reserve really believes if the Biden administration really believes the Fed bears responsibility for inflation, why are they renominating these officials? Why aren't they putting people in who actually can solve the problem? It makes no sense. But that's the endless blame game the Biden administration likes to play. Americans are sick of weak policy in Washington. It's time for the Federal Reserve to start fighting for real Americans, not Washington politicians. It's clear that the Fed needs new, independent, and courageous leadership to truly address our nation's economic problems. Weakness in Fed leadership has produced unsustainable monetary policy that threatens the long-term economic health of our country. It's the very thing I've been warning about for months. But it's clear that the current leadership of the Fed just doesn't care. They don't deserve to hold these seats. They've lost the trust of the American people, and they should be replaced with individuals who will actually stand up for American families and protect the American economy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Massachusetts.